So welcome to the video which introduces the key readings for topic 2, which is about attitudes and perceptions of inequality. And the two readings are Gimpelson and Treisman on misperceiving inequality, and Jonathan Mijs, who looks at the paradox of inequality, how income inequality and beliefs in meritocracy go hand in hand. So why are you expected to read these two readings for this particular topic? Why are they the key readings? Well, both readings establish the misperceptions that ordinary people have about inequality and consider a variety of explanations for this. They also assess the implications of such misperception for how people respond politically and socially to high levels of inequality. Gimpelson and Treisman argue that theories of the political consequences of inequality, that is, about how levels of inequality affect demand to redistribution or levels of political conflict or violence, how such theories must take into account the high levels of public uncertainty and misperception about the scale of inequality. So Gimpelson and Treisman argue that such theories need to be reframed as theories about the political effects of perceived inequality, not objective inequality. Jonathan Mijs is also interested in misperception, but he focuses on something quite specific, the paradox of inequality, which is why societies with increasing levels of inequality don't show growing popular concern about it. And he argues that the reason for this is that high inequality societies produce social conditions which limit people's experiences and social encounters, and that affects their perceptions and values. He argues that inequality segregates social and spatial environments, and the more inequality there is, the more segregated our social environments become. So people see less structural inequality, and they come to assume that society is broadly meritocratic. Both readings should help you to understand the empirical data on how people perceive, misperceive and respond to inequality, but also to consider a range of different explanations for these patterns. So let's look at Gimpelson and Treisman first. So it's a statistical analysis using quantitative cross-national survey data. Gimpelson and Treisman identify a number of different ways in which ordinary people misperceive economic inequality, and that includes inaccurate understandings of the level of inequality in their own country, whether that's income or wealth, inaccurate understandings of salary levels of different occupations, of how rich the rich are, the proportion of people in poverty, as well as having a poor sense of their own relative position in their national income distribution. And people also have a poor sense of trends of inequality over time, whether wealth and income inequality, for example, has got better or worse, or whether poverty has increased or gone down. People have a poor sense of that too. And Gimpelson and Treisman argue that there are important implications of this level of misperception for theories of the effects of inequality on political outcomes. So they note that various theories have suggested that greater inequality should create political pressures for income redistribution, or might create conflict or even political violence. But Gimpelson and Treisman say, well, actually, these theories are really hard to substantiate empirically. There's no consistent evidence that countries with high inequality do actually redistribute more, or that higher inequality promotes more political violence. So why is there this poor link between objective levels of inequality and political outcomes? And for Gimpelson and Treisman, the problem is that all these theories assume that people accurately perceive the degree of inequality in their country. But they argue that assumption is simply wrong. There's a great deal of uncertainty and misperception of inequality. So the reason that people don't respond to it, to inequality as various theories might predict, is because they simply don't know how much inequality there actually is. And they argue that it is actually people's perceptions of inequality, however wrong those perceptions might be, rather than the actual objective level of inequality, which shapes political outcomes, such as preferences for redistribution or class tension. They show empirically that the level of perceived inequality is a much better predictor of people's preferences for redistribution than the actual objective level of inequality in the country in which people indicate their preferences. And similarly, it's actual poverty levels are poorly correlated with tensions between rich and poor, but actually perceived poverty rate is a much better predictor of class conflict. But that begs a question then, well, what shapes people's misperceptions of inequality? And Gimpelson and Treisman identify four what they call plausible hypotheses, four plausible theories. Firstly, they argue that individuals may overgeneralise from their immediate reference group, so making biased inferences. People assume the people around them are representative of the broader society, and they're generally not, so they misunderstand the amount of inequality there is. The media and television, Gimpelson and Treisman also argue, may foster perceptions of extreme wealth or can publicise data about actual income. So actually the media could reduce misperceptions, they argue, and it partly depends on what the media is reporting. A third factor they look at is ideology, which they argue may predispose people to see the level of inequality their beliefs and values convince them must exist. So one of the things we find, for example, is that citizens in post-socialist countries appear particularly sensitive and concerned about inequality. And that maybe reflects the ideological legacy of communism, which attempted to reduce inequality, in fact did reduce levels of inequality, and spoke very negatively about them. Those countries are obviously not communist anymore, but the argument is that the citizens of those countries may still be affected about those beliefs and values that they experienced growing up. And then finally, Gimpelson and Treisman suggest that other psychological effects might be in play. So people might have a desire to blend in, or they might have a desire for self-esteem, and that might cause people to think that they're more average or normal than they really are. So that kind of where people tend to put themselves in the middle of a society, no matter how rich or poor they are. So four potential hypotheses here. How does that relate to the kind of problems that Jonathan Mijs is exploring? Because he's exploring a similar set of issues, although in a rather more focused way. So Mijs comes up with a rather different alternative explanation of what's going on in misperceptions of poverty. He argues that cross-national survey research on attitudes reveals what he calls a paradox of inequality, and that paradox is that the societies with increasing levels of inequality have not been accompanied by growing popular concern about that fact. In fact, citizens in more unequal societies don't express more concern about inequality compared to those in much more egalitarian society. And over time, the relationship between levels of inequality and people's belief in meritocracy is also paradoxical. So as inequality goes up, people tend to see their societies being more, those unequal outcomes as being meritocratically produced. And that's surprising, Mijs says, because we might expect people to become more concerned about inequality as it increases, and also see it as less fair, less legitimate. The opposite seems to be the case. Rising inequality appears to make people more likely to see the inequality in their society as meritocratically produced and so legitimate. So he establishes this using survey data examining the trend in meritocratic beliefs in different countries from 1987 to 2012. And by meritocratic beliefs, he doesn't mean whether or not people think meritocracy is a good thing, but rather whether or not they think their society is actually more or less meritocratic. So these surveys measure the emphasis that people place on hard work in determining who gets ahead in their society. The survey also asks them about whether structural factors such as family, wealth and connections, to what extent they also determine who gets ahead. And his findings suggest that long-term increases in inequality are accompanied by a stronger belief that those outcomes are meritocratic, while belief, interestingly, in the structural aspect of inequality, that as an explaining who gets what, that remains relatively stable. So as people who grow up with rising levels of inequality, if their structural beliefs remain stable, but they believe more strongly in meritocracy, so they're likely to see inequality as more likely to be produced by sort of fair, justified outcomes. So he says, in sum, income inequality is accompanied by popular beliefs that dampen people's concerns by legitimating the growing income gap as meritocratically deserved. But that again begs the question, how do we explain this? What's going on? So in attempting to explain the paradox, Mijs identifies two main potential explanations, which he identifies in the other literature, for why people seem concerned about high or rising inequality. So firstly, many theorists have suggested that people may be unconcerned because they're unaware of the extent of inequality, and that's partly what Gimpelson and Treisman suggest. The alternative explanation is that living in an unequal society may actually make people more tolerant of inequality. So they get used to it, potentially get used to it, and they develop successful coping mechanisms for dealing with any potential negative outcomes of high inequality. Now, Mijs does not dismiss those explanations. In fact, he draws on both, but he uses both to develop a kind of third alternative explanation. For their growing tolerance of inequality and their greater resistance to redistributing income and wealth in more unequal societies. And his explanation says that as inequality goes up, it creates specific social conditions which shape perceptions and beliefs in such a way that people increasingly come to believe that inequality is the outcome of fair, meritocratic processes, where success simply reflects talent, ambition, and hard work. So he accepts that people misperceive key aspects of inequality, and he agrees that they become more tolerant of inequality as it increases. But he says the crucial element to both of those processes is in how rising levels of inequality shape social conditions and increase the misbelief that inequality is meritocratically produced. He thinks that societies with high economic and social inequality affect perceptions because of how they shape people's experiences and social encounters, and thus their perceptions and values. So he focuses on how inequality directly shapes people's lives. He says its direct impact on people's experience, which is really important, through wages and unemployment or employment, but also through the social and spatial environment in which the rich and poor people in a society lead their lives. He says as inequality goes up, particularly in income inequality and wealth inequality goes up, this creates greater spatial and social distance between the wealthy and the poor. They live their lives in different institutions, in separate and segregated neighbourhoods, schools, workplaces, and they also find friends and romantic partners in their own segregated social circles. So what he's saying is that as inequality increases, rich and poor people are increasingly unlikely to encounter each other. Or even to see each other. Because unequal societies are marked by greater social distance, people develop their understanding of society, he says, and their own place in it from a position of what he calls socio-economic insulation. In more unequal societies, people underestimate the extent of inequality, as well as the role of structural advantage or barriers that might help or hinder people, because they simply can't see them. They seem much more restricted section. As a result, he argues that inequality creates the social conditions for its own legitimation. So, a quote here from Mijs. The argument here is that high inequality creates spatial and social segregation, which creates what he calls cognitive barriers. As the inequality gap grows larger, he says, other people's lives fade out of view. So high inequality, and the higher it is, paradoxically, the more it insulates people from seeing the full extent of it. People underestimate the structural forces that make for inequality because they're increasingly unable to see it because the people around them have the same kind of structural conditions, and they don't see people in very different structural conditions. Note also that Mijs thinks the role of the media in affecting people's views of inequality is limited. He focuses on direct experience. He says, without direct experience of social conditions, news reporting and statistics about inequality are not likely to change people's perspectives, nor lead them to develop empathy for the plight of unseen others living across the income divide. So he says it's your direct experience which really shapes how you see the world and which filters how you respond to the media or political information about inequality. And that's a question for you to assess. So we will look at these both these readings in greater detail in both the lecture and workshop. But one of the things to consider is what are the implications of both of these arguments for Gimpelson and Treisman. If we want people to be more concerned about inequality, what do Gimpelson and Treisman, what do they think we should do? What practical steps might we do to increase people's accurate perceptions of inequality? And then secondly, what are the implications of Mijs' arguments if we want people to be more concerned about inequality? What practical steps might make people more aware of the structural factors shaping inequality and how these are as important, if not more, than hard work and talent, for example? How do the implications of his argument differ from those of Gimpelson and Treisman? And a hint here: consider their respective arguments about the role of the media in shaping people's perceptions or misperceptions.